This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. My guest today joins me from Montreal, but I invited Mayuri Mukherjee to join me in this conversation, not because she lives in Canada, but because she has a really unique vantage point. Mayuri Mukherjee has been going to Israel as an Indian, first as a journalist since 2012, and then she decided to study security and technology in Israel, first in a master's, then, of course, a continuing PhD, first living in Tel Aviv, then in Jerusalem, and at the moment she's completing her PhD from Hebrew University. She has this unique vantage point of an Indian who spent a lot of time engaging not only with Israel and its people, but also with its security community. She's seen what happens in Israel and what happens in Palestine from very close quarters as an Indian. And I invited her to have a conversation with me to talk to me about her unique vantage point and how Indians, in a sense, India has become a really critical ingredient country in this conflict, in this current war between Hamas and Israel. How should Indians really perceive and understand this conflict and where India stands in this entire conflict? Thank you, Mayuri, for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Hindol.
I want to talk to you first, Mayuri, about your unique vantage point that I just mentioned. Talk us through a little bit because you really saw from very close quarters a transition of the Indian state's response, in a sense, to Israel from 2012 right up to present day. There was a sea change in that response, publicly, especially during this period. Talk to us a little bit about your experience of living in Israel, what you saw in Israel about Israeli life and the conflict Palestinians, and also India's vantage point in this entire imbroglio.
So when I first started engaging with this issue, I was working with the Pioneer, which was, a center-right paper in a very left-wing media environment, and Yes, and that's when I started engaging with this issue. My first visit to Israel was in 2012 for a media seminar, learning how, at that time as a young journalist, learning how to cover conflict. And, since then, as we went through the 2014 war in Gaza, but also the change in government in India in 2014 and then subsequent years, you did see the change in in the Indian government's approach towards Israel. I would like to highlight, though, that, it's not as if we just woke up in 2014 with the new government and things just changed overnight. Of course, these processes were where they were happening quietly for a while. What happened under Prime Minister Modi was that things became more public. He was much more publicly pro-Israel, but a lot of the work that, the background work towards that was already there in place. Nevertheless, we did see, some of the minor things, but that sort of builds the bigger picture. For example, I remember during the Sharm el-Sheikh declaration about whether India would mention in its declaration about Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, East Jerusalem as a capital of a future Palestinian state. Anybody that's actually ever lived in Jerusalem will tell you that is it's just not going to happen. And a capital, Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem is very, very unlikely. And you saw that the Indian government's position change over time. So little things like that from the government policy perspective, we saw that change. And of course, Modi very publicly being pro-Israel, that of course, but also you do see that, there is still a sense of continuity, and very rightly so, that remains in India's public policy towards the Palestinians, towards the Palestinian issue. Even now we see, for example, aid to Palestine. We see a call for, that of course, that India wants for a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian issue in accordance with UN resolutions, which has been the constant Indian position for a while. So, so from So from a policy perspective, that's sort of where we have been. There's been change, but also a sense of continuity, and is that sort of balances out in that sense. From a more personal perspective, I remember, the first prime minister, initially President Pranab Mukherjee's visit to Israel. Then, of course, Prime Minister Modi's visit to Israel, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to India, where he spoke, those were all of these very high profile, big visits, really brought a lot of attention to the bilateral, lots of positivity, lots of, people to people ties. And you really felt the energy during those very public and highly publicized visits. From an even more personal point of view, as someone who's lived in Tel Aviv, but also in Jerusalem, as I lived in Jerusalem, technically in West Jerusalem, but really on the Green Line, on the border of East and West Jerusalem. Literally, the Green Line ran through our car park, basically. We lived in the university, close to the university, in the gorgeous Mount Scopus campus of Hebrew University. And that is exactly on the border. And you really, you really live that sort of, you're really on the edge of that conflict, right? So we lived in West Jerusalem, but we got our groceries from a supermarket in East Jerusalem. We had Arab Palestinians delivering our taken, because when restaurants are closed on the weekend for Shabbat, we would order in from East Jerusalem, right? So you really feel it in a very different way. But at the same time, when there were, say, disturbances, which happened, of course, Jerusalem can be very, very volatile in some ways. And, we had disruptions right in front of campus. That was always, there have been issues like that. In Tel Aviv, friends going into bomb shelters now because of the rocket attacks. You really live the conflict in a different way. And it, does that, how, as an Indian, how do I perceive that? I would say it really kind of hits home, with our experience with terrorism. And the fact that this kind of mindless violence and the way in which it disrupts innocent civilian lives, it's something that, for those of us who grew up in India, we are familiar with. And then you see that in Israel, and you understand it hits home more closely. And of course, when the events of October 7th happened, our initial reaction was that, oh my God, this is Israel's 26/11, right? Or 9/11. But in a way, it was also more than just 26/11, because I remember when 26/11 happened in India. At that time, also I was abroad, and I was very concerned for family and friends. And but all of this was happening in Mumbai. My parents and family and friends were mostly in Calcutta. No one was really directly affected. India is a big country. Something can happen in Mumbai, and you can still go on with life in Calcutta or in Delhi, and it's fine. But Israel is a very, very small country, right? Like it's, for those of us who come from big countries, it's really hard to imagine how tiny this country is. Like, you can go from the northern point to the southern point in 5 hours, right? At its narrowest, Israel is it's a 30 minutes on a bicycle. That's at its narrowest. For such a small country. So when something like this happened, like today, there is not a single Israeli family that doesn't know someone who has been affected by what happened on October 7th. And that really changes how you perceive that conflict. But also as a point of difference would be that I think when 26/11 happened, or other subsequent attacks, previously, say, the parliament attack happened in India, I did not remember a time where India then had to prove, at least to the global public, that we have been wronged, that this is not okay, that 2611 is not justified. Like, we didn't have to go out and prove that. We did not have people coming out on the streets and saying that, hey, India deserved it. No matter what your view was, say, on India's Kashmir policy, and there is place for criticism over there also, but at a global scale, there was this acceptance, sort of, which what also happened with 9/11. You can be critical of US foreign policy, US security policy, but still accept without ifs and buts that what happened on 9/11 was unacceptable, was not okay. What happened on 26/11 was not okay. But when it came to Israel, suddenly we found ourselves having to justify or to explain ourselves that no, you cannot just do this. You cannot breach, you cannot go into people's homes and rape and kill and murder and burn people alive. That is not okay. Like, this is not acceptable. It is not an acceptable response to anything. And I think that for me was a big difference in how I had experienced these things as an Indian, and how I now experience this as someone who is invested in Israel, as someone who has family in Israel, so that, of course, was something that was very different. Also, the issue then, the comparison between, this was also something that came up a lot, was a comparison between, oh, you are Indian, you have lived under the British, your country was oppressed by the British. How do you not understand the Palestinian point of view? I understand the Palestinian point of view, but also, if you look at how the Indian freedom struggle was conducted, I do not remember a single Indian nationalist leader, or even of the thousands and thousands of foot soldiers who contributed to our freedom struggle, engaging in the kind of barbaric behavior that Hamas and Hamas terrorists have done on October 7th. And and frankly, I find that offensive when people compare the two. And I'm like, have you ever heard of, forget about Mahatma Gandhi, who of course officially espoused a policy of nonviolence. Even our leaders who did use violence as a legitimate tool to secure their political goals, be it Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, Khudiram Bose, or Shahid Bhagat Singh, or even going back to Mangal Pandey. I don't ever remember hearing about Indian leaders, any of them going into the homes of British officers and raping their wives and burning their babies. So yes, that's a fairly wide.
This is very, very important perspective, Mayuri. Allow me to ask you, and it's important for our viewers to know, you're of course married to an Israeli. Did you lose, or did your husband lose anybody they knew in the October 7th attack?
Yes, by God's grace, our immediate family and friends are safe, but we have in our extended circle of family and friends, we still have missing children. We don't know whether they were killed or they're being held hostage in Gaza. We know of our, again, like I said, within extended circles of people who have died. And it's been extremely, it's been a difficult time for us.
I want to talk to you a little bit about now, to try and understand what you saw from your vantage point living in Israel, because you lived in Jerusalem, you lived in Tel Aviv. You gave us some very interesting perspective on East Jerusalem a few minutes ago. Talk to us a little bit about daily life that you saw there, including your vantage point as an Indian, as I said. How were Indians perceived there? However, you just explained to us about people asking you, presumably from the Palestinian side, how do you not understand this conflict? What about from the Israeli side? What conversations have you had or engaged with from the Israeli side, from your vantage point as an Indian on this conflict?
I think now in India, in Israel, there is um, a genuine recognition of the fact that the vast majority of Indians understand the Israeli situation and are in favor, and that there is a generally positive response to Israel. I think the vast majority of Israelis understand this. And of course, as you know, many young Israelis travel to India right after their military service. So many Israelis actually have their own first-hand experiences of being in India, of living in India, of living in a country that is where you don't have a problem with anti-Semitism. And of course, this is something that, again, I've learned to appreciate much more now that I'm married to an Israeli. And, just to give you an example, when when the news of this of the hospital attack broke, initially the news was that it was an Israeli airstrike that was responsible for it. And of course, eventually later on, within a few hours, we learned that it was not an Israeli airstrike, but a misfired rocket by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And but within the course of those few hours, here in Montreal, we had at least 1,000, 1,500 people on the streets opposing the airstrike, or what was considered Israeli action. And that stems not because you are anti-Israel, or that a lot of that just comes from pure anti-Semitism. And that experience with anti-Semitism also I did not understand previously when I was this is something that is very new for me to really feel it and to think about what it means to live in a country where you deep down, like we have a mezuzah on our door, and which identifies that this is a Jewish household, and I worry about it. That is it safe for us to have the mezuzah on the door? Of course, we're not going to take it off, because then you feel that you're giving in. But that concern is not something that I've ever had to deal with before. And Israelis, and I understand more where Israelis come from and why they truly appreciate, for example, that experience in India where you don't have to worry about these things, really.
So the Canadian Daniel Bodman, I think he's a stand-up
Yes.
comedian and a political analyst who was also on Global Order a few weeks ago. I saw his tweet that how relaxing he thinks it is when he realizes that actually Indians genuinely don't know and don't understand anti-Semitic tropes. That
Yes.
anti-Semitic jokes, quote unquote, fall flat on Indian
They
ears
just fall
because
flat.
they just don't understand the context at all.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. Occasionally in Israel, we've had conversations about the use of the swastika, about why does the India statement to the UN, why is it not as pro-Israel as say an American statement would have been? Mostly with my friends who are also fellow IRs students, but I think there's overall people acknowledge that India is much more pro-Israel than say what you would see in Europe or in other countries of the West.
It's important, of course, here to also quickly mention that I think there is also a growing recognition, which didn't perhaps exist even 5-10 years ago, that the Nazi swastika and the Hindu swastika are very, very different. In fact, the Nazi swastika is not a swastika at all. It is the hooked cross or the Hakenkreuz,
Yes.
which was wrongly labeled. If you read Hitler's Mein Kampf, he never uses the word swastika. He uses Hakenkreuz, the hooked cross, so to speak. And then in sort of Anglo-Saxon translation, so to speak, primarily by the British and then Americans, this was either mischievously or otherwise changed to
changed
call
in,
it the
yes.
swastika.
And this
That's sorted. Yes, please go on.
this is absolutely an issue that comes up a lot, and I think there is space now to have a clear-headed conversation. I mean, and we've I think it was like what, a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, Shein, the Chinese company that sells low-cost apparel, they had a swastika pendant or something that they were selling on their Israeli website, which led to a lot of resistance. And I remember being in these Facebook groups with other Israeli women, and we talked about it. And there was, by and large, this understanding that no, we understand that the swastika is a religious symbol that is important to other cultures and other religions, and that is separate from the Nazi symbol. The question then is that, while we do make this in our heads, we do understand it. Do I, for example, as someone maybe as a Holocaust survivor's grandchild, do I still want it in my home, or will I still wear that pendant or not? Which is a very personal response, For example, because I'm a practicing Hindu, so we have the swastika in our little mandir at home. But before that, I had a conversation with my husband about how he feels about it, and he was like, it's perfectly fine with me. But it was important to have that conversation. Similarly, I remember during Diwali celebration on campus in the university dorms, the students we did the swastika with diyas, and it was outdoors. It was during COVID. It was the celebration was outdoors, so everybody that was living in the dorms could see the swastika symbol. It was not just something that only us Indians who were celebrating could see, but everybody in the dorms could see it. And I remember again having conversations with some of the Israelis there, like, hey, is this okay? If you're uncomfortable, we can change it. It doesn't have to be there. Like, we don't, at the end of the day, we are in Israel. The Holocaust is still very much within living memory. There are Holocaust survivors who are still alive, and of course lots of young people have family members who are Holocaust survivors. So this is a very, very live, very an issue that can it's very personal in some ways, right? And so you want to be sensitive towards that, especially when living in Israel. I would, for example, not put the swastika on my door if I, in my home in Israel. It's perfectly fine to have it indoors in my little mandir at home, but not outside. And we can do that sort of, understanding. But I think, again, like you said, in the broader global sort of conversation, there is definitely an understanding that, and I think it again comes because so many Israelis go to India and they see the swastika being used in temples and everywhere, and they see that this has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, and it really comes from your lived experience, and which is really the most powerful experience that could that could shape your opinion or your perspectives.
Talk a little bit about your lived experience then, Mayuri. Talk to us a little bit. I saw some very interesting tweets from you, including quoting some other tweets, giving a very nuanced perspective to the Israel-Palestinian conflict from really a lived experienced vantage point, explaining the Israeli position and the Palestinian position, and indeed the rather toxic influence of Hamas in very nuanced terms. For our viewers, could you take us through this nuanced perspective that you have gathered as an external, but also now clearly an insider, as an external person, and but also an insider now in some senses in Israeli society?
So I think, what happens is when you look at it from the outside, it seems like the whole conflict is black and white. So if you're pro-Israeli, then you'll be like, there's nothing that the Palestinians can do right. Hamas are terrorists. The Palestinians are all anti-Semitic, bloodthirsty people. There's nothing they can do right. If you're pro-Palestinian, then there's nothing that the Israelis can do right. It's occupation, colonialism, genocide, apartheid, all of that. And there's really no there's no conversation to be had in between. And I think the fact that very young people often have these very extreme positions, and where those extreme positions are coming from, I think that's also a very important conversation to be had. But I want to set that aside. But if you live in Israel, you really do see a more nuanced perspective. For one, you, for example, see the experience of Arab Israelis. A lot of people don't realize this, but 20% of Israel's population are Arabs, whether you call them Palestinians or not, but they're Arab Israelis. They have full Israeli citizenship, all the same rights that the Jewish Israelis have, and some of them are Muslims, some of them are Christians, but they make up for 20% of the of Israel's population, and they thrive in Israeli society. Are there occasional problem points? Yes. You know, during this conflict, for example, you had an Arab Israeli actress who put out some problematic tweets in support of Hamas or whatever. So yeah, I mean, you know, no, so it's never picture perfect. But I'm saying that overall, does the community is it doing well in Israel? Yes. Are they reasonably well integrated into Israeli society? For the most part, yes. My husband worked for a Israeli for a startup in Jerusalem, which was co-founded by a Jewish Israeli and an Arab Israeli. His boss was Arab, and you know, so you see that coexistence is most certainly possible, but you also see the limits of coexistence. So, for example, that while people may work together, their residential areas are often segregated. It's hard for Arabs to find rental apartments in the heart of Tel Aviv. So, you know, again, nothing is black and white. You see back and forth. With the occupation, with the whole narrative around occupation, right? Particularly with Gaza. Again, yes, Israel controls the airspace and entry and exit points, but really the fact is that there is, since the disengagement plan, there has not been a single Israeli soldier who is physically present on Gazan soil, right? So how elastic you want your definition of the occupation to be, that is a more broader conversation to be had. But the fact is that Gazans were responsible for their own administration, their own day-to-day lives. Hamas was elected by Gazans, right? And the Hamas has ruled Gaza since the disengagement plan. And you know, does that mean that so again, and you know, this goes back to the issues that we've had with electricity, water supply, this and that. Why is that an issue? If Hamas had invested in civilian infrastructure instead of using that money and resources to develop rockets to throw into Israel, Gazans would have a much better life. And also, if Hamas had not taken the path that it did, and Gaza, you could have had a peaceful community in Gaza, then that would have put even more international pressure on Israel to dismantle whatever remaining control it had in terms of say controlling the airspace, not allowing an airport, etc. But we never got to that point of the conversation.
No, it's very interesting that you say this, because one of the things that occurs to me as somebody who's only visited Israel, that after the disengagement, as you say, one of the things that Hamas did when it came to power was built this entire, really an underground city of tunnels, which is being discussed today, and not enough bomb shelters. Israel is full of bomb shelters, and please correct me if I'm wrong. You would know this better than I, where we've seen video after video of people running to bomb shelters, in
Yes.
Israel, whereas Hamas doesn't. allow or hasn't built bomb shelters in Gaza, but has built all these tunnels, which are obviously used for various terror activity. So the money for the use of everyday Gazan life, so to speak, is a very powerful point. But do go on. I mean, in your opinion, how does this conflict, is this an epochal conflict? I mean, is this a conflict that changes everything?
Um, but I will come back to that question. But I wanted to go back to the point that you raised about bomb shelters, because that really is such a telling point. Israel invests in these bomb shelters. Every single building has a mamad or a reinforced room or a bomb shelter. Whether it is a private apartment, a public building, every single building has it across the country. And Israel invests in this because it values the life of its people. I'm not saying that Israeli politicians are not, that they are some special great people. No, they're not. They are also just like politicians and political leaders around the world. They can also be corrupt. They also engage in cynical politics, all of that. But at the core of it, as a society, Israel values its lives. Israel values Jewish lives, Arab lives. It values its people, and it does not intend to use its people as human shields. This is what Hamas does. Hamas, in its whole strategy, revolves around using its people as human shields. And this is why, for example, even now, right, like there is so much criticism about Israel's airstrikes. You have this whole underground city. Why not move your population underground, right? But of course they won't do that, because then you don't have your victim, your human shields, right? Like, so that doesn't serve its purpose. And yet, and it's not just Israel, right? Even in previous conflicts, when Moscow was bombed in previous wars, the people were moved to bomb shelters in the metro. It's not something special. Even in this conflict, when Israel asked for Gazans to move from North Gaza to South Gaza, there was so much talk, oh my God, this is displacement, this and that. And yet Israel itself had moved its population from the south, from the north. There are entire villages that have been evacuated and people have been moved. In fact, a lot of Indian students who have now gone back, thanks to Operation Ajay, who have now gone back to India, many of their dorm rooms are being repurposed as housing for those who have been displaced. And students are very willingly opened up, allowed for that, please, happy to, if we are not here, to repurpose the rooms. And but of course, you don't hear of any of that in Gaza. You're only hearing about people being deliberately being left to die. And this is, to me, this is so telling that, at the end of the day, you can fight for whatever political means that goals that you have. But you can fight while taking care of your people, right? If Hamas, when it launched this attack, which from Hamas's point of view was a spectacularly successful attack, right? And they knew that Israel would retaliate. What did you do to protect your population from that retaliation? Nothing. And I think that sort of takes, for me, to like, it goes back to the larger point of Palestinians not having the political leadership that can really take them towards peace, towards a mediated solution. Instead, you have a political leadership that constantly feeding them this genocidal view that we will go back to 40. You're not talking about 67. We're going back to 48 borders. Israel will no longer exist. How do you? I mean, Israel has a population of 9 million people. Where are 9 million people are not just going to disappear? They're not just going to go jump into the sea, right? When here, even in the West, when we see demonstrators chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is all of Israel, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. That is all of Israel. And we can have conversations about the Nakba but for every one conversation about the Nakba, there will be another conversation about the Jews who were thrown out of the Arab lands and this and that. And my point is that we can keep going back to having these conversations about who lived where and whose great grandfather lived where. Point is that where do you want to live, and how do you want to live, and can you live next from the Palestinian side? Are you willing to live next to a Jewish state? The Palestinians have been offered a state many times. They have consistently refused it, including the 2000 offer from that Arafat refused and instead launched the second Intifada. This is so. Then, to me, what it seems like is that the Palestinian leadership, whether it is Hamas in Gaza or even honestly the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, right? They are mild, a few degrees better than Hamas, but really, if you look at some of the statements that they put out, they're just as problematic. And again, neither have been able to build a state, a pre-state, right? Even in India, before we became independent in 47, we had a pre-state. We had a transitional government that would lead us then on to independence. Israel, before it was established in 48, it already had a pre-state in place. You had a government. You had hospitals, universities. The defense forces, right? Haganah was a guerrilla force, which then overnight was repurposed and reformed by Ben-Gurion into the IDF. So you don't see that pre-state in place really, either in Gaza or in the West Bank. Neither Hamas government nor the PA government are really investing in state building, and nobody's going to build your state for you at the end of the day. And this is where I really feel that I wish to see. I don't think that there is anything specially problematic with the Palestinians, that for some reason they're not being able to bring together a political leadership that will lead them in the correct direction. But it's just that we don't see that leadership at this point. From the Israeli perspective, what has been is that, we tried, this is not working. We can't develop their leadership for them. We don't have a partner for peace in the Palestinians, so we will do what we can just to manage the situation. And this has been especially Prime Minister Netanyahu's approach to the Palestinian conflict, is that we manage it. Okay, so we're not looking for peace. We're not looking to make any changes. We're not even looking on the other end of the spectrum to wholly occupy Gaza or wholly occupy the West Bank or anything of that sort. We just manage what we can. You do your thing and we keep our peace. And when there is a problem, we will go in and try to sort out the problem temporarily. In Gaza, we often hear of this, the mowing the lawn strategy, that, we go in every couple of years when there's a flare-up. We go in, we try and dismantle Hamas infrastructure as much as we can, and we come back up. But as we saw October 7th, that doesn't work. You cannot manage the conflict in that sense over a long-term period. It will at some point erupt, and it will then subsume Israeli society, Israeli citizens, and that Israel has it is in Israel's interest, as much as it is in the Palestinian interest, to help develop some kind of political leadership in Israel, within Palestinian society, that will truly be a partner for peace, that can commit to a two-state solution, with and the rest of it can be negotiated, where the exact border will be, Jerusalem, this and that, those things, settlements, all of that can be talked about, right to return. But the fundamental idea that Israel exists, and an Arab state and an Israeli Jewish state will exist, will have to coexist, I feel like somewhere deep down, that idea first needs to be the political leadership. You need the Palestinian political leadership to push for that basic concept. And once there is that, and once you have, then you can work towards the using diplomacy to figure out the actual dignity. There are several solutions of what proposals for what a two-state solution can look like, etc. And also and I think once you accept that we will have two states, it will also make it possible for the Palestinian leadership as well as the Israeli leadership then to make the necessary compromises. Right now, I think, because the Palestinian leadership is not committed really to a two-state solution, and there is no demand for it really from within the Palestinian society, so then whatever proposal comes your way, until and it is exactly what you want, they will throw it away. There is no place for compromise. I mean, again, compare it to the Indian, when India was partitioned in 47, India lost a huge chunk of land, right? Like, I think people don't necessarily, if two entire countries were formed out of British India, and our leaders, also on the Pakistani side, the Muslim League leaders, ultimately they agreed that, okay, this is what, I'm sure, Muslim League leaders also wanted more, Indian leaders also wanted to give less, but ultimately on the eve of August 15th, we agreed that this is it. And even then it was a horrifically bloody partition and all of that, and we are still, in some ways living with the aftermath of that. And but that acknowledgement that, for us from the Indian side, Pakistan exists, and eventually Bangladesh exists. We're not trying to kind of go back and make one big country again. They exist. We will sort out our borders, but they exist. From the Pakistani side also, okay, this is our country. This is where we are. We're not going to go try and occupy Delhi again. So I feel that, and these are hard compromises. I mean, it's the same with the Irish resistance, for example. Again, right? Every single nationalist
spirit of compromise you feel is missing.
Yes, you have to make those compromises. We can then, you can have a discussion about, but was it the place of the British to partition? It doesn't matter. The British were the default sovereign, for want of a better word, of mandatory Palestine, of British India, and they did what they did. Same with the French, same with the colonial powers. We can't rewrite history and go back, and then you go back to the Ottoman Empire, and from before that you go back to, that's pointless, right? So you work with what we have today and
compromise,
yes. And and I think this is where really you need better political leadership and that's once you have that, then, for example, the sort of incitement that you see in Gazan society, the kind of absolute rubbish that their children are taught is horrific. I mean, what else do you expect for a child who has been taught the worst of anti-Semitism in schools that are funded by the UN, which, by the way, is again, of course, funded by very broadly, but by international, we are all complicit in that.
Mayuri, I want to ask you, for all the reasons that you have elucidated, including, of course, an indoctrination in a sense that happens from the very childhood in Gazan society, in schools funded by the United Nations, and in public discourse and otherwise. Tell me, do you think that this particular conflict that has broken out now, in a sense, is epochal in any way?
Um, I do believe that it changes many things
What does
at a
it
very
change?
fundamental level. For instance, Israel's willingness to compromise, um, Hamas has lost Israeli society by doing this. But one of the sort of side effects of this managing the peace thing was that from the Israeli side, Israelis didn't really see what was happening on the Palestinian side, and a generation of Israelis really came of age believing that no, we can have peace, we don't need to control the West Bank, or within the West Bank, maybe not say area A and B. We are not interested in going back to reoccupy Gaza. We can live side by side with we need a Palestinian state. There was a lot of criticism, particularly of the occupation, or however you put it, of Israeli policies in the West Bank and in Gaza. But October 7th changes all of that, because now the narrative is that, oh well, no, we can't live with these people, right? That this is just not possible. How that then Israeli position has just become that much more hardened, I hope that if we come close to a solution at some point, that by then Israeli political leaders will be able to temper popular opinion. But for now, I have seen so many people who went from being center left, or we are anti-occupation, anti-blockade, this and that, to being like, occupy Gaza, there is no way we can deal with this, and that also, and to be honest with you, but that's also not a solution. There's no point going, like, you can't occupy Gaza long term. It's a hostile population there. You will lose lives either which way. So yes, in that sense, I see a big change in Israeli popular opinion. How much of it is really just the reaction? It's still so new. The wounds I have not yet are still, you're still bleeding. Israel is still counting its dead. We're still identifying the remains of the dead. So yes, there is, of course, right now the sense that, okay, this is it. We can't live with them. I do hope that over time that will change. That if that if there is a political solution, that there will be that public opinion can be channeled accordingly. From the Palestinian side, I don't have a sense of what it means. I really don't have a sense of how they see it, or other than what you see really on TikTok videos of young people celebrating it. But I would like to believe that people Palestinians who actually live in the region, whether in the West Bank or in Gaza, that they are more that they also see the same thing that we see, that this was a horrible idea, that this is not there is no political victory in this. There's a common idea or concept, as they say, that the Palestinians only gain something when Israelis are made to lose something. So you had, say, the second Intifada, which then led to the disengagement plan. I feel that, as an IR scholar, I feel that Israeli, that is a bit of overdone point, and that it really depends on how you massage the data to what conclusion to shape the conclusions you want. But this, I really don't think that the October 7th will lead to some. This is not the Yom Kippur War. This will. I don't see how it could, in its immediate aftermath, lead to something like a peace plan with the Palestinians. Things will get a lot worse before, in terms of the Israeli retaliation, and I would like to, in an ideal world, to see Israel go in, clean out Hamas infrastructure, wipe out Hamas leadership, and then, have a hand over political control to the PA or something. But the point is that the PA is also not particularly. The PA barely holds on to its ground in the West Bank, and it does that with Israeli support. I don't see how the PA is any better, or what kind of new leadership can we think of, and where the new leadership has to come organically from society. You can't just paradrop political leaders from, so I think those are sort of the broader questions, and we really don't know. At least I don't have a sense of how that might unravel. I mean, if something comes out of it, if some major changes in terms of, if it makes Israel rethink its policies, if it makes, in terms of managing the conflict versus actually working with Palestinians to resolve the conflict, then that is a worthy goal. If within the Palestinian society, some way there is an option for an organic leadership, for leadership to emerge organically that can work with Israel, that's of course a worthy goal to work towards. But we'll see how this plays out. Those are very long-term ideas.
On that worrying note, though, thank you very much, Mayuri Mukherjee, for explaining in great detail your unique vantage point and experiences in Israel as a student, as a resident of both Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and now, of course, married to an Israeli, of this entire terrible conflict between Israel and Hamas. Thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and it was a pleasure being talking to you. Thank you so much.